Hola everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
perfect.
Hola, thank you so much for coming on your Friday evening and my Saturday morning here in New Zealand. It's a great pleasure and privilege to talk with you this evening, and I hope that you find it useful. I thought I would start with a couple of observations or quotes. The first is from obviously the famous linguist Noam Chomsky, where he says in his 1975 book on language and the mind that questions of language are basically questions of power. So one of the things that I often talk to my own students about is that talking about language policy, talking about language education or linguistics, intercultural issues are never just about those things. They are always situated within wider socio-historical and wider socio-political contexts. And those contexts are inevitably framed by questions of power. Who has it, who doesn't, which languages are valued, which aren't, whether bilingualism or multilingualism is seen as a good or a bad thing. All of those come out of histories of colonialism, histories of nation-state formation, the establishment of national languages, which I'll talk about shortly. So just bear that in mind, those macro issues. And the second quote is also a very famous one that was first attributed to the German sociolinguist Max Weinreich in the 1940s, where he says that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And the point there, of course, is that we know that the principal differences between languages and dialects are hard to determine linguistically. Some languages are mutually intelligible and some dialects are not. And so what we have come to understand is that languages, if they're regarded as languages, again, it's often the product of history, politics, and whether those languages are recognized by states. As soon as a language becomes a national language or a language of the state, then it tends to be ascribed with higher value and seen as a language, while other language varieties are often marginalized and constructed as dialects or patois. So just bear those two sort of key aspects in mind. And I just want to start then, work from the macro to the micro, and I'll come to implications for teaching and learning as I proceed. But I just want to start from the macro context again, and just highlight some of the issues that I've just talked about in relation to history and politics and the construction of bilingualism or multilingualism as a societal issue, not just an individual one. So where I want to begin is with this history of monolingualism. And what's really interesting in my work on language rights, particularly my 2012 book, which is here, is that monolingualism as a sort of public ideology is only a recent historical phenomenon, really only in the last 4 to 5 centuries. And it's a product specifically of modern nation-state formation and the construction of national languages. So we know, for example, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that 95% of the country speaks English, and as I understand it, in Colombia, 99.5% of the Colombian population speaks Spanish, both national languages that have emerged out of colonialism in both contexts and as a result of nation-state formation in the last 400 to 500 years, as I said. And the other key attribute of the establishment of national languages is that they were based on an ideology of replacing other languages. So it was really a zero-sum game. No matter how many indigenous languages were spoken or a variety of languages spoken in a particular territory, the national language was seen as replacing those languages over time. How is this achieved? By language selection. standardization, and then institutionalization, particularly through education. So a language was selected, it was then standardized and institutionalized primarily through education, sometimes through the armed forces as well over time. And what this did inevitably is what Tony Liddickett, the Australian sociolinguist, applied linguist, talks about as reinforcing specific linguistic hierarchies of prestige. So if we think of our current context, national languages are at the top of the chain nationally. English currently is the current world language, the lingua mundi, also increasingly the most spoken second language and language of wider communication, lingua franca in many instances. But certainly within national contexts, yours and mine, it's the chosen national language which sits at the top of those linguistic hierarchies of prestige. And the result of all that is an emphasis on linguistic homogeneity. And as I said, this very strong emphasis, particularly in the public realm and particularly in education, of monolingualism as the norm. So let's just briefly conclude on this. So there's another very interesting book that was written in 2016, The Invention of Monolingualism, which I very much recommend to you, by David Gramling. And what he observes in this book, an argument much along the lines I've just made, is that it's a recent phenomenon, but whether we opt to call it a myth, a pathology, a paradigm, a relic, or a sham, monolingualism, this idea of public monolingualism, is now woven into modernity's most minute and sophisticated political structures. So even though it's a recent historical phenomenon, it has become so normalized that we just accept it intrinsically. And monolingualism's underlying principle, he argues, has never quite been that other languages are bad or inferior, although I would suggest a slightly different take on that, particularly in terms of its combination with colonization. Often that indeed was the case, that other languages were seen as bad or inferior. But Gramling's argument is that the key thing is that monolingualism manages other languages. It doesn't necessarily oppose them. So the fact that you're doing a master's degree in interlinguistic and intercultural studies is speaking back to that normalization of public monolingualism. We see it every day. We often take it completely for granted. And so thinking about alternatives is a really important aspect of critiquing that. And just to give you one example, just drawing on Asia as an example here, just again to highlight the history of this, is that prior to the establishment of nation states in the 16th or so century, empires were generally, which preceded them, were generally much more multilingual. So if we take the Qing Empire, for example, in China, that had 4 language varieties: Manchu, Tibetan, Mongolian, Uyghur, and of course Mandarin. Putongo Chinese languages were widely used, and the script there comes from an early document of the Qing Empire, where you have Manchu on the left, Tibetan second, Mongolian third, Uyghur fourth, and Chinese on the right. And so empires were multilingual. Basically, if you paid your taxes and gave allegiance to the political authorities, they didn't worry so much about making everyone monolingual. It was only really nation states, as I said, particularly in conjunction with colonization, that has seen that develop. And that's been the case for centuries, since the 16th century. And we are only just within sociolinguistics and applied linguistics now coming to turn again to issues of multilingualism. Because basically, as I'll go on to argue, in applied linguistics, particularly in second language acquisition, we have adopted many of these monolingual ideas in our teaching and learning approaches, because, as I said, they've become so normalized. But there are 2 developments, recent developments, that have started to reorientate applied linguistics, particularly around questions of bilingualism and multilingualism. And the first, as you may well have heard, is this notion of superdiversity. which was a term that was developed first by the British sociologist Stephen Verdevec in 2007 in an article in Ethnic and Racial Studies, the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies. And basically Verdevec argued that there were significant changes in the way that migration and transmigration in a globalized world, that it was changing, that it was increasing, and that as a result of those rapid changes, cities around the world, particularly in the so-called developed countries, were becoming exponentially more diverse, hence the term super diverse. And a key attribute of that diversity in Verdevec's initial study was also focused on multilingualism. So his study was based in London, and he was looking at the increasing ethnic and linguistic diversity and the expansion of multilingualism in London. But that concept has since been taken up widely, particularly in sociolinguistics and applied linguistics. And I recommend this book to you as well, edited by Arnault and colleagues, the late Jan Blomet, the Belgian linguist, and others. And basically the idea here then is that superdiversity is characterized by a tremendous increase in the categories and numbers of migrants, not only in terms of nationality, but also crucially for our purposes, language, religion, and other aspects. And also in terms of how migration and transmigration work. So it used to be the case when one migrated to another country that you became fairly quickly assimilated because you had little contact with your home context. But now, of course, with the internet and with migration and transmigration going to and fro, there's a lot more opportunity to maintain languages in new contexts if one chooses to do so. So that's the notion of superdiversity. It's been picked up particularly in sociolinguistics over the last decade, championed by, as I've said, particularly Jan Blomet, the Belgian linguist, also Ben Rampton and others whom you might come across in your studies. And it's really at the macro level asking or highlighting the fact that multilingualism is increasing, but also that multilingualism is normal. Excuse me. And then there were a whole lot of other allied developments and a whole lot of other terms that have developed over the last 10 years or so. I just give you a brief example of the many terms: polylingual languaging, metrolingualism, which is the idea of multilingualism in big cities, contemporary urban vernaculars, flexible bilingualism, translingualism, which is Suresh Kanakaraja's term, and probably the most common one now, the idea of translanguaging, that we move constantly between the language varieties that we know. So all of these terms really are trying to describe not only this expansion of multilingualism, but starting to unpack and highlight how multilinguals work in everyday and how languages work. And what we find is that often these linguistic repertoires are very complex, they're very fluid, they're very dynamic, and you may be well aware of this yourself in terms of your own language backgrounds. And so bilingual and multilingual speakers move very freely and very often among and between the language varieties that they know. So this notion of superdiversity has led to this focus over the last 10 years or so on multilingualism and the phenomenon of complex multilingual repertoires. I, in my own work, have endorsed it to a certain extent, but I also criticize it for its lack of history. The idea that multilingualism is suddenly a new phenomenon, as I've just told you. For example, empires were multilingual for millennia prior to the rise of the nation state. Indigenous peoples have always been bi and multilingual because of colonization, and often exhibited complex bilingual and multilingual repertoires way before anyone in sociolinguistics decided that multilingualism was interesting. And the other aspect of in sociolinguistics of linguistic superdiversity is the idea that it's only when Western sociolinguists have decided that multilingualism is interesting or interesting enough to explore that suddenly it becomes prominent, whereas those in other contexts, in non-Western contexts, have long argued that this is exactly the case and that it's the idea of monolingualism that has been abnormal. But sociolinguistic superdiversity is a really important concept, and one to keep in mind in terms of your own work looking at interlinguistic and intercultural studies. So now I want to turn to what I want to speak about for the rest of this time, and the implications for teaching and learning is this related notion that I first termed the multilingual turn, which was really taking those ideas and looking at how they impacted, or how they should impact, on the way that we teach languages and the way that we learn languages. And in an edited collection that I put out in 2014, where I brought together a range of international scholars to discuss these developments, what I argued there in the introduction was that this idea of the multilingual turn has usefully foregrounded or highlighted multilingualism rather than monolingualism as the new norm of applied and sociolinguistic analysis. It's also increasingly challenged ideas of languages as kind of bounded and unitary and discrete. This is the notion that we move among our language varieties much more freely and fluidly and dynamically than our previous understandings of language teaching and learning, which I'll go on to talk about, allowed. And also brought into question issues of the native speaker, the mother tongue, and argued instead for a sort of more fluid understanding of languaging as voice, as social practice, and as Blomet talks about, a sociolinguistics of mobile resources. So the multilingual turn basically tries to take the notion of superdiversity in a simplistic sense and apply it to language teaching and learning. And if we do that, what are the implications for language teaching and language learning in light of that? Well, the first, as I've said, is that we shift from the idea of the monolingual speaker as the norm to the multilingual speaker as the norm. And that requires, if we do so, to begin with their bilingual or their multilingual repertoires, rather than ignoring them, which again I'll go on to talk about shortly. We also need to see language as performative. It's often spoken, it's dynamic, it's innovative, it changes, it adapts in terms of context, in terms of interlocutors, in terms of the combination of languages or language varieties spoken. And languages or language learning is crucially interdependent. What we know from research, again, over the last few decades in neurolinguistics, for example, is that bilingual and multilingual speakers have an interrelated functions in the brain. So knowledge of one language variety always interrelates and works with knowledge of other language varieties. It was a term that was first popularized a couple of decades ago by the linguist Jim Cummins when he talked about the notion of common underlying proficiency, that basically everything in the brain in terms of languages is interconnected. It's not siloed. It's not separate. It's interconnected. So if we take those, that has specific implications for how we teach and how we consider the best ways of learning languages. The other aspect of this, if we think about it, is if we acknowledge that bilingualism and multilingualism are dynamic, then we move from a sort of understanding of languages as discrete, as separate, as structurally distinct, instead towards focus on actual communicative practices. How do bilinguals and multilingual speakers actually interact? What do they do with the language varieties that they know? And if we think of, there's a very famous early linguist, Ferdinand de Saussure, in the early 20th century, who made the distinction between langue, the structure of the language, and parole, speech. And what we've seen over the course of the 20th century is that linguistics is focused almost entirely on langue for much of the 20th century and ignored parole, speech, actual dynamic practices. And this is the shift that superdiversity and multilingualism and the multilingual turn is now accomplishing, focusing now more on parole, on actual language practices, actual language use. And when we do that, we can see that a learner's bilingualism or multilingualism is not a failed attempt at becoming monolingual, but is rather emergent, creative, dynamic, and judged on its own terms, not in relation to the dominant language. Translanguaging, I've already mentioned, has also over the last decade become increasingly studied in relation to these issues, popularized initially in Wales, but then taken up in the US by Ophelia Garcia, for example, and Li Wei, who have been very prominent in promoting the notion of translanguaging, involving, in their understanding, multiple discursive practices, hybrid language uses, and while acknowledging, at least initially, its complementarity with code switching, also in more recent times arguing that it's even more dynamic, even more enmeshed than code switching. Translanguaging also acknowledges the issue of multimodality, which again has implications for teaching and learning, the different modes, language modes. And all of these emphasize a repudiation of the monolingual and often deficit constructions of learners that have dominated second language acquisition, teaching English as a second language, and also foreign language teaching, really for decades. And it's to those ongoing monolingual precepts and practices that I just want to turn now. I'll go through those, and then I'll come back to how we might rethink them in light of this multilingual turn. But let me turn first to second language acquisition. I don't know, some of you, I assume, may have a background in SLA, and it's regarded, at least in applied linguistics, in the applied linguistic context, as the sort of preeminent discipline, particularly when it's linked directly to psycholinguistics, for example. And so very powerful, very influential, and tends also to shape how we teach and how we learn. So let's look at these precepts or understandings of SLA, particularly the monolingual ones that still remain despite the developments I've just talked about. So SLA is the study of how second languages are learned. In other words, it's the study of the acquisition of a non-primary language, that is the acquisition of a language beyond the native language. It's the study of how learners create a new language system with only limited exposure to a second language. It's a study of why most second language learners don't achieve the same degree of knowledge and proficiency in a second language as they do in a native language. And in general, SLA refers to the process of learning another language after the native language has been learned. So what we see here is an understanding of language as a system, going back to the idea of langue that I mentioned before, de saussure, that monolingual speakers are the norm, because what they're assuming is that we're all native speakers and then we're learning an additional, a second or third language. As a result, bilingualism and multilingualism is seen as sequential and discrete, and the focus is on acquisition and language use. And also in so doing, of course, there's a very strong presumption that language learners aren't very good, or not as good as native speakers. Going back to the earlier observation that it's a study of why second language learners don't achieve the same degree of knowledge and proficiency. So the idea of often adult learners not being great language learners. So intrinsically a deficit construction. So those are the presumptions, and I'd suggest that they're all very embedded within a monolingual understanding of language teaching and learning, because they ignore multilingualism and the multilingual repertoires that I've just discussed. They also underemphasize the difficulties inherent in distinguishing between different language varieties. So they treat languages in a very reified and a very discrete, distinct way, often static, rather than seeing them as dynamic, contextual, changing, and, as I've argued in terms of the multilingual turn in superdiversity, as intermeshed, interconnected. It also ignores bilingualism as a continuum. So we can move in any language from an emergent bilingualism through to very strong bilingualism, but you could be also a very strong bilingual speaker, but not necessarily writing or reading in the particular language variety. So it depends again on the language mode. And the key thing about bilingualism as a continuum is that is often socially determined. So it depends on the context as to whether you're able to learn other languages. In my own country here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as I said, English is the dominant language. It's the language of colonialism. It's the language that usurped the indigenous Maori language, which was initially the language of wider communication, the language of trade at the start of colonization, also the language of education for the first 30 or 40 years. And now, of course, it's in a process of revitalization because 20 to 30 years ago, it was deemed that it might actually die out. And so we have reinstated it in education and have seen an significant increase in the number of Māori language speakers as a result. But of course, the point is that has only occurred because the social, historical, political context has allowed it to re-enter, for example, the educational domain. So I'm always cautious in discussing bilingualism and multilingualism around the terms full bilingual or complete bilingual, and certainly don't use the term semi-lingual, which was often used in previous decades to describe people who were just emerging bilinguals, because what that does is attribute their level of language, often in deficit terms, to the individual, when in fact the opportunity or the ability to be bilingual or multilingual, as I've said, is often determined by your context. And I'm not familiar directly with your context, except to know, of course, of the dominance of Spanish. But certainly you might want to consider that in terms of your own individual and collective context. You know, what language varieties are valued, what domains are they present in, how are they used, and then how are they taught. And then the final aspect that I've already discussed is that if we accept these SLA principles, these monolingual SLA principles, we ignore the fact that language is dynamic and changing. The idea of language as speech or performance. De Saussure's notion of parole. And what are the pedagogical consequences of this kind of monolingual understanding of SLA? Well, it results in a focus on error analysis. So because, as I said, we presume if we adopt these principles that adult language learners are not good learners and that they're never as good as native speakers of the language, of the target language, then the focus is often on error analysis, on the errors that they make. And in so doing, we also look at interlanguage, the interim language system, but if it's foreign language or second language acquisition, is still seen as the target and the measure. We also highlight notions of fossilization, which is described as the end of learning, where features become permanently established in the interlanguage of a language learner in a form that's deviant, that's different from the target language norm. So again, a deficit construction, error analysis, interlanguage, fossilization, all seen in negative deficit terms. We also then construct language mixing and code switching and certainly translanguaging as unhelpful and counterproductive. And in a lot of our teaching and learning contexts, we rigidly exclude the languages we already know when we are teaching a target language. And this is because of the principle of time on task, the supposedly common sense idea that the more you focus on the target language, whether it's a foreign language or a second language or whatever it might be, the more likely the student is to acquire it. And I don't have time to talk about this today, but this is based on that misunderstanding of the brain being siloed, and the idea that if you allow the dominant language or the languages that students already know in their bilingual or multilingual repertoire, if you allow students to draw on those, in this view, that's seen as problematic because it undermines, in their view, the focus on the target language. But that view is predicated on a view of the brain as siloed, when actually, as I've already argued, it's not. And so knowledge of other languages always interacts with the one that you're trying to learn. And so pedagogically, It should be the opposite then, that we should allow students, in fact, we should facilitate students to draw on their full linguistic repertoire in the learning of a target language. So those are the monolingual precepts of SLA, which still dominate despite developments in sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, and despite some very long-standing critiques of this understanding of language teaching and learning. And so let me just briefly rehearse the latter for you, and again highlight this. I talk about this in my introduction in the multilingual turn, where this understanding of second language acquisition and the idea of how languages are acquired has been critiqued, particularly from non-Western contexts, for 20, 30 years. So Kartsuru, for example, in the Tessol Quarterly in the early 90s, talks about the fact that fossilization is irrelevant to situations in which a second or an additional language has definite societal roles in the linguistic repertoire of its users. So one of the other things that SLA does consistently is ignore the context of language use. It's a very abstract, a very hermetic, sealed view of language, coming back to that notion of treating language as a structure and not looking at how it's actually used. And Kartsuru goes on to argue that all the languages in a multilingual's repertoire complement one another to produce the type of composite language competence that suits their needs. So as bilinguals and as multilinguals, we adapt our language practices depending, as I said earlier, on our needs, on the context, on the interlocutors, on the domains of language use, and so on. And then in the same Tessol Quarterly, I think this was 1994, in the commentary, Sridhar much the same argument against SLA, saying that given the aim of SLA is ostensibly bilingualism, one would expect theories to build on the natural laboratory of bilingual communities worldwide. With rare exceptions, they don't do that. And as a result, they see bilingualism often in deficit or subtractive terms rather than as additive or positive. And so just to conclude, Sridhar argues that if we see bilingualism as a positive attribute rather than SLA seeing adult language learners as poor language learners who are never as good at the target language as monolingual speakers of that language, if we reframed it, then the negative characterization of the overwhelming majority of L2 language, second language acquirers and users as speakers of interlanguages, that is, in effect, as failed monolinguals rather than successful bilinguals, that would be turned around. But because it isn't, often these speakers are seen as lesser or negatively ascribed or attributed in relation to monolingual native speakers. So that was a non-Western critique. And then basically from about 1995 to 2010, we also had what was called the social turn in second language acquisition. And there's a very good book by David Block, 2003, called The Social Turn in SLA. But basically it proceeded from about the mid-90s onwards. There was discussion within second language acquisition about the limits of this monolingual understanding of how language teaching and learning should develop. And so Firth and Wagner, in a very controversial article in the Modern Language Journal in 1997, talk about the fact that mainstream SLA fails to account in a satisfactory way for interactional and socio-linguistic dimensions of language. So because it treats language solely as abstract, because it doesn't take account of context, because it doesn't take account of speakers, readers and writers' multilingual repertoires, it fails to account for how we actually use language and, as I said, the wider socio-linguistic dimensions. What's needed instead, they argue, is an approach which highlights how language is used as it's being acquired through interaction, and how it's used resourcefully, contingently, and contextually. So again, the idea of performance, of use, rather than acquisition, the significance of context, and so on. So you can see how these critiques within SLAs align with our more recent understandings of superdiversity and the multilingual turn, focusing on the dynamic nature of language use rather than a very abstract construction of language acquisition. And just to show you how that might work in terms of terminology, what we see in the social turn, at least in SLA, is an attempt to rethink some of the terms. So rather than talking about hierarchies of first languages, mother tongues, second languages, additional languages, maybe looking at language learners in terms of their language expertise, which will vary depending on the context and depending on the languages and how well they know them and where and how they use them. But nonetheless, it's a much more holistic, positive conception. Similarly, the idea of the native speaker always creates a linguistic hierarchy that target language learners, second language learners, foreign language learners can never achieve. This is the underlying principle of monolingual conceptions of SLA. So moving away from that, they suggest to something like language inheritance, which allows us to draw in, for example, heritage languages or relearning languages of our families or our wider community that have been lost generationally, but which we might want to pick up again, for example. Also Indigenous languages, of course, in relation to contexts where they're spoken. And again, the negative notion of interlanguage, moving it towards something like a more neutral notion of language affiliation. And the L1, L2 distinction, which is, as I said, in SLA, often seen as sequential and discrete. But if we take Viviane Cook's notion of multi-competence, then again, we can emphasize the positive that bilingual and multilingual learners are not failed dominant language learners or second-rate target language learners. They bring multi-competence to the language teaching and learning process. And so Cook argues that the starting point should be what second language learners in this context are like in their own right, rather than how they fail to reach standards set by people they are not by definition. So the social turn has been very influential, and as I said, it was a critique from within about the monolingual aspects of SLA, but interestingly, most standard SLA theorists and certainly most standard SLA texts have simply ignored them. So as one example, standard texts on SLA still frame, even today, although this quote comes from 2006, but not too much has changed in relation to standard texts over the last 15 years or so. They still frame as interlanguage any L2 output which deviates from the so-called native-like and assume that only full mastery is attained really by native speakers. Just one more thing in relation to SLA though, and again, this also aligns with recent developments in superdiversity and the multilingual turn. And that is, again, within SLA, and it hasn't yet affected standard text, as I've just said, but it is the most current thinking, is by this group called the Douglas Fir Group. And just to give you a little context about this, in I think the 2014 American Association of Applied Linguistics annual conference, which was held in Portland in the US at that time, a group of very senior SLA theorists got together after the AAAL conference in a room at the hotel that was called the Douglas Fir Room, which is how they got their name. And this group of senior SLA theorists, predominantly North American, basically began to start thinking and discussing and then put together for the Modern Language Journal a special issue around moving away from these monolingual precepts in SLA, and particularly the over-preoccupation with cognitive at the expense of sociolinguistic contextual use and context. And so they argue that most theories and insights of our SLA remain strongly cognitive in orientation and generally ignore other research. So going back to the social turn, although it was a very robust critique of SLA, SLA pretty much ignored it. And certainly, as I said, the standard texts remain largely the same. What's interesting about the Douglas Fir group is that they recognised the significance of multilingualism, and also going back to the notion of superdiversity, how it's interconnected with globalisation. Although, as I observe, ironically, they don't really discuss that further. But what they do argue for is a new transdisciplinary approach, an attempt to draw on related disciplines, and in order to develop a sort of more holistic and a more dynamic view of language learning. And that, because they were senior SLA people, that was a very influential special issue. Again, you can find that in the Modern Language Journal in 2016. And just to I'll come back to that. So basically, the Douglas Fir group emphasizes or starts to understand the idea of the multilingual turn, in effect, that when L2 learners participate in particular social contexts, they do so as actors, and they are historically situated, they're context sensitive, and their language use is determined, or not determined, but certainly influenced by and related to their multiple social identities. And some L2 learners may find that the opportunities they have to access language learning are limited or constrained by the ways in which they are positioned by others. So this is also the really first real understanding in traditional SLA about the wider context and the ability of people to learn languages. As I said right at the start, the idea of complete bilinguals or full bilinguals, and certainly the idea of semilinguals, both of those are extremely problematic because they situate any language learning in the individual, when in fact it's the context that determines whether you can learn a language fully, whether it's valued, whether you can learn it through education, whether you can learn it and use it in specific language domains. All of those aspects are actually societally determined and often shaped by history, by colonization, as I said, certainly in my own context with Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, certainly with the indigenous languages spoken in still 850,000 speakers of approximately 60 to 70 indigenous languages and 2 Creoles in Colombia. So whether those languages are maintained, whether they continue to be spoken, where and how they're used, is really determined by the social, historical, and political context. And then just to draw this together, and then just to finish with a discussion on implications for how we might rethink teaching and learning in light of these arguments. There was also a subsequent supplement of the Modern Language Journal in 2019 that extended these arguments around how we might rethink SLA. And what this supplement tried to do was to respond to some initial criticisms that the initial 2016 special issue was dominated by white North Americans, often monolingual speakers themselves. And so this supplement draws on a much wider international range of commentators, including me, among others, and addresses some of those issues. But I just want to focus in particular on one article in that 2019 special issue by Lourdes Ortega, a very prominent SLA commentator, many of you I'm sure will know. But she just again returns to the notion of the monolingual bias in SLA and argues that, as I've said, despite all of these other developments, these factors still remain. The idea of a late start, and always framed negatively, that adults are poor language learners. And we see this in terms of the fundamental difference or the critical age hypotheses, which still linger around in SLA circles. She talks about the fact that there's still an often rigid distinction between languages, L1, L2, and also, interestingly, a focus only on standard language varieties. So not seeing bilingualism or multilingualism as a continuum, as I said earlier, not seeing different language varieties, or more colloquial, more informal language varieties as valid either. And a phrase that I particularly like that she talks about, she says that SLA is still studying the weirdest multilinguals in the world, basically elective bilinguals, so those who choose to be bilingual, often monolingual, so they're learning it additionally as adults, often elite and university-based in terms of their instruction, and they're, of course, learning an additional language sequentially and discretely. And so this continues to ignore the much more common worldwide phenomenon of simultaneous multilingualism or bilingualism, which is how most multilinguals live and work, with a simultaneous range of a number of languages at their disposal. And it also ignores the idea of circumstantial bilinguals, that is, those whose bilingualism is viewed as not elite or positively, but is viewed as negative or as an obstacle to teaching and learning. So a lot of Indigenous language speakers, certainly Māori speakers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, were historically, and still are by some, viewed, the use of te reo Māori is viewed negatively. It's seen as unnecessary, it's seen as low status, particularly in relation to English. And certainly migrants around the world, going back to the notion of superdiversity, often their primary languages are viewed negatively, and the goal that others make for them, and often they internalize it themselves, is to shift from the languages they know to the dominant language in the context in which they are. So again, the idea of elite versus circumstantial bilinguals is a social and political and historical phenomenon that we need to take account of in our understandings of teaching and learning. So I'm just going to skip the next slide and just come to just a very brief discussion of translanguaging, and then I'll finish up in the next few minutes. So translanguaging is, as I said, probably the most prominent strand in broadly speaking of the multilingual turn. As I mentioned, Ophelia Garcia is a prominent person in this, Lee Wei. There's also a very recent edited collection by Jeff McSwan that I recommend to you. And the key aspect of translanguaging is really, and this is a very simplified understanding of it, is that basically, if we think going back to the idea of the interconnectedness of all the language varieties that we know, then it's not surprising really, as bilinguals or multilinguals, that we will intermesh them, that we will use them and move between them freely, dynamically, and often in ways that are hard to distinguish. And so while historically in language learning we have focused to some extent on translation and to a lesser extent on code switching, which is still seen negatively in many traditional language learning contexts, and certainly translanguaging is even more progressive. So this is a way of trying to rethink and trying to incorporate actual language use into the language learning context. I'm going to skip to that and then just finish off with some discussion of pedagogy. So if we were to adopt translanguaging in relation to pedagogy and thinking about the multilingual turn, how we might rethink our traditional approaches to language teaching and learning, then we would start by using students' emerging bilingualism as a resource. So rather than treating it negatively, rather than seeing them as failed monolinguals or less than native speaking monolinguals in the target language, we start with their bilingualism and we see it as a resource that we can draw on, acknowledge, use, leverage in the teaching and learning process. And so rather than expecting bilingual speakers to perform like monolinguals, we might also then think that bilingualism is instead fluid and draws from learners' entire linguistic repertoires, depending on the context, the time, the task, the focus, and of course, who they're interacting with them, for what purpose. Again, if we take an understanding of translanguaging as part of the multilingual and its implications for pedagogy, how might we rethink that? Well, then we would enhance teaching and learning by building directly on actual bilingual practices and enabling students to demonstrate what they know rather than what they don't. And as I've already argued, this accords with research on bilingualism and neurolinguistics of the brain over the last 40, 50 years. The idea I mentioned earlier of Cummins' notion of common underlying proficiency, the related notion of linguistic interdependence, the idea of metalinguistic awareness, knowledge of how language works, and then obviously if you're bilingual or multilingual, knowledge of how the languages that you know, the language varieties that you know, interact with each other and how they're similar and different. Bilinguals and multilinguals have a much greater metalinguistic awareness, generally speaking, because they're moving between and among the language varieties that they know and have to distinguish them not just on the basis of understanding, which a monolingual speaker does by context, but also by form, by how they are similar and different. And using the full linguistic repertoire of a student is also perhaps the strongest basis for achieving academic language proficiency in the target language. So the complete reverse of the time on task principle, which says you should ignore all the languages that the student brings with them to the classroom and instead focus solely on the target language. This understanding is the complete opposite. We should draw on, where we can, the full linguistic repertoire of students to support their academic language proficiency in those language varieties and in the target language. And that also allows for, in translanguaging literature, mixing up the modes, so moving between reading, writing, speaking and listening, focusing on, for example, exploratory talk as a key means of a dynamic interaction in the classroom, and again, focusing on language use rather than language acquisition. So just in the last 5 minutes that I have, let me just draw out some implications here and then I'll just conclude. So what are the implications of the multilingual turn? Well, as I've said repeatedly throughout this, we really need to begin with the learner's linguistic repertoires. What do they bring to the classroom? And that doesn't require, as teachers, for us to know all the language varieties that our students have. What it requires us to do is to allow them to facilitate that linguistic knowledge in the classroom process, and for us as teachers and us as students to not to see that as a positive rather than a negative phenomenon. So we need to rethink this focus on time on task because it's fundamentally ineffective. It doesn't basically work. Within wider educational contexts, we often talk about the importance of prior knowledge, moving and also moving from the known to the unknown, scaffolding via Vygotsky's notion of zone of proximal development, for example. So we often emphasize the importance of prior knowledge, but we do that in all contexts, it seems to me, except language, where we say, we ignore, as I said earlier, what you bring to the classroom and we ask you to start again in the target language. And then we wonder why learners don't achieve as well as they might. Other implications, we might need to think about how multimodalities, particularly in terms of technology as well, might be incorporated into our teaching and learning processes. And also how we might draw on multilingual resources. So even now, coming back to standard SLA textbooks, and certainly in some TESOL English second language contexts, like Cambridge, CALTA, for example, we still see a reluctance by teachers and certainly in those contexts of using even bilingual dictionaries, for example, somehow impacting on the time on task principle. But we should, of course, be able to draw on all the bilingual or multilingual resources that we can, because, as I said, if we acknowledge students' total linguistic repertoires, then we should allow them to use resources that allow them to make the links between the language varieties they know and the language varieties that they're learning. All of this means, as I said, in relation to the multilingual turn, that the multilingual speaker is the norm, and that we should view learners' bilingualism and multilingualism as emergent, creative, dynamic, and judged on its own terms, as I've said. And it also requires that we reject these lingering and still very entrenched monolingual and deficit constructions of learners that have dominated and continue to in SLA, in TESOL and in foreign language context. since their disciplinary inception. In my slides, which you're welcome to look at, I won't speak to them now. I just give you a couple of examples of how one can do that in the classroom. First, by the use of group work, and secondly, by the use of language resources. And so I'll leave those for you to discuss if that's of interest. And I'll just final slide. It's going right back to my first initial observation that language education, language teaching, issues of linguistics, and issues of intercultural communication, they're never just about those things. They're always socially, historically, politically framed. And that requires, if we are to make a shift along these lines, we need to change some fundamental ideologies. And in order to make that ideological shift in foreign language teaching or second language teaching or whatever it might be, we need to fit our methods to our learners rather than the other way around. As I've said, we need to see bilingualism and multilingualism as a norm, and crucially also to see bilingualism and multilingualism in any combination of languages as a positive attribute. So that addresses some of those wider macro linguistic hierarchies of prestige, which see some languages as valuable but not others. Learners should draw on their total linguistic repertoire, drawing on their prior knowledge, and teachers need to facilitate rather than obstruct teaching and learning processes that recognize emergent, dynamic, and interconnected bilingualism and multilingualism. So that is just a very brief and a very simplistic overview of the multilingual turn in education and its implications for teaching and learning. But thank you once again for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I wish you all the best for your studies. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for Professor May for this enlightening talk. You took us from the monolingual perspective to the social turn, then to super diversity, and now to the multilingual turn, and how this new pedagogies, translanguaging, and all these things, super diversity and modalities can help us take advantage of the multilingualism that's being recognized these days. We will have a couple of minutes for some questions. If you have some questions or comments, either here or online. Have any questions? Maruhe has a question. Okay, Maruhe. Yes, go ahead, Maru. Your mic.
Oh, no. I was saying congratulations, but okay. Thank you very much, Professor May, for, this enlightening talk. Yeah, it was very, interesting for our students who are recently enrolled in the program. I'm just curious about something related to the revitalization of the Maori language. Well, as you said, the Maori is an indigenous language in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We also have in Colombia, many indigenous languages, like over 68 in our national constitution, and we are doing a lot of research to preserve these indigenous languages. So I want to know about the process of this revitalization. You said that now Maori is taught in schools. So was that a bottom-up or top-down process? Who was involved in these decisions?
Sure. So basically, Māori language revitalization began in the early 1980s. So we've had nearly 40 years of it now. And it was initially a bottom-up, a grassroots, what we call a flax roots phenomenon. So it came via Māori communities themselves, establishing initially kohanga reo, early childhood centres, where very young children were taught through the medium of Māori by elders, kaumatua kuia we call them, kaumatua male kuia female elders. And that was, as I said, a bottom-up phenomenon. It then progressed to elementary school in the 1990s, and around about the late 1990s, the New Zealand state, incorporated and then funded Māori medium education. So it began as a bottom-up movement, but it became a movement supported by the state, although it's still, still reaches only proportionately about 10% of the total Māori student population in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So although it's been highly successful, and although it's been recognised internationally as an exemplar of Indigenous language revitalisation, it still only reaches a minority of Māori students themselves. There's about 4% of the population that are not Māori who are also in Māori medium education. So it's not exclusively Māori, but it is predominantly so. And again, as I have just been writing about recently, what we're seeing in the wider context in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a little bit of a pushback against the increasing normalisation of te reo Māori, particularly by older white monolingual English-speaking New Zealanders. And I've been just writing about that recently in relation to the notion of linguistic racism, how we can address that as a societal issue. So basically, because education has been very successful, and because there's an increasing visibility of Māori speakers in other contexts as well now, some older monolingual English-speaking New Zealanders are becoming uncomfortable with that and have been criticising it. So it's a constant battle. Te reo Māori, the Māori language, is still in danger, as are the majority of the world's languages, and certainly all of the world's Indigenous languages. But the fact that it's been well established for 40 years in the educational domain and for 20 years in the media, with the advent of Māori television in 2004, it is beginning to be more widely spoken again, and also passed intergenerationally on from parents to children. Those who are now parents who went through Māori medium education are passing it on to their children. So it has been highly successful, but as with any language revitalisation process, particularly Indigenous ones, it's also always an ongoing battle, an ongoing contest against some of those wider negative attitudes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor May. I think we have one last question by Professor Chavez. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor May, for the presentation. Very interesting connections to the social cultural turn and the complexity turn of Douglas peer group and so on. It seems that the power dimension of language is unavoidable, but we can somehow manage it in pedagogical terms, as you have suggested in your conclusions. I would like you to comment a bit on how we can handle this power turn in research terms. We have had this exclusive paradigm war between the quantitative and qualitative and mixed methods as a sort of synthesis. How do you foresee this in research methods?
Thank you. It's a very good question and not an easy one to answer. I've in the multilingual turn, in the introduction that I wrote for that, and also the chapter that I wrote for that, I talk about the fact that the difficulties of shifting these monolingual understandings of language teaching and learning also lie with the construction of disciplines and the very strict disciplinary borders that remain. So SLA has been resistant both from without and from within, because cognitive linguistics based on Chomskyan notions of abstract language use remain dominant. So the simple answer is that we need much more transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work that transgresses those boundaries. The challenge is that that's much harder to do because it also challenges those kinds of academic hierarchies and also the methods and the research methods that are linked with them. So in my own work, I mean, well, I sometimes wonder what I am, but my background is in linguistics and my academic work, and my academic work is applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, education, and sociology. And so part of my interdisciplinary, and I hope at times transdisciplinary interests arise from that kind of background. But I think it does require us to think about how we engage our students in conversations that are that go beyond the strict disciplinary boundaries that many of us have professionally been instructed in, and that's a challenge. I think the other aspect of it is that, in terms of my own work, is the idea of advocacy or language activism, and our role as public intellectuals, and how we might particularly talk to and try and influence a range of stakeholders, not just academically, but also in terms of policy, and particularly families and parents and communities. Because a lot of these hierarchical views of language and negative views of bilingualism and multilingualism are societal, as I've argued, and are often internalized by bilingual and multilinguals themselves. So part of my constant role here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is to talk to as wide a range of groups as I can about the merits of bilingualism and multilingualism, about the merits of Māori medium education for children, and so on. So I think the other challenge is how do we bridge the academic public, academic policy public spaces, and how we can deal with those. Certainly, I remember a quote from Joshua Fishman when he was still alive, when he was talking about the disestablishment of bilingual education programs in the US. And I remember he made a comment that was something along the lines of, why are facts, i.e. research, so useless to the discussion about bilingual education? And of course it was because it's situated within those complex political and social and historical contexts which saw Spanish as a threat in the US and was seen as a means of trying to address that. So even when our research is robust, it doesn't necessarily change policymakers and parents. And so that's where I think we need to have that role as public intellectuals in terms of explaining the benefits and doing that to as many people, as many groups as we can. It doesn't really answer your question, but because it is, I think, it is the key really in terms of some of the things we've discussed. You know, how do we establish or break down these academic hierarchies within the ivory tower of universities, but then how do we also engage across contexts in terms of these wider historical, social, and political contexts?
Yes, thank you, Professor May. Sorry, my camera didn't work. I don't know what happened.
It's okay. Thank you, if you want to.
Well, thank you very much, Professor May, for your talk. And we hope to have you again in our program, maybe here in Colombia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Okay.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.